For 27 years, I had lived peacefully on the eastern shore of Lake Willow. My grandfather purchased this land when there was nothing but forest surrounding the pristine waters. He built our family cabin with his own hands, and I eventually transformed it into my permanent home after retiring from teaching biology at the local community college. The lake was more than just a body of water to me. It was my sanctuary, my daily rhythm, my connection to something larger than myself. Every morning I would sit on my dock as the sun rose, watching blue herons stalk the shallows and deer come to drink at the water's edge. In spring, the chorus of frogs was so loud it would keep visiting friends awake. In summer, the lake would swell with rainwater, the shoreline creeping up almost 30 feet from its winter boundaries. The seasonal rising and falling of Lake Willow was as predictable as the migration of the Canadian geese that visited twice yearly. From May through August, the lake would expand dramatically, fed by mountain runoff and summer thunderstorms. By September, it would begin its slow retreat back to its winter boundaries. This cycle had repeated without fail for as long as anyone could remember. My neighbors, the few who lived around the lake, understood this natural rhythm. We built our homes on higher ground, positioned our docks to accommodate the changing water levels, and respected the lake's temperament. The western shore had always remained undeveloped, protected by both its remoteness and the fact that most of that land became submerged during the summer months. The first hint of change came on a crisp autumn morning. I was enjoying my coffee when I noticed unusual activity across the lake. People in bright vests were placing stakes in the ground, walking with surveying equipment, taking measurements. Initially, I thought little of it. Perhaps it was a nature conservation project or part of the county's water management program. 2 weeks later, the heavy machinery arrived. The distant sound of chainsaws echoed across the water as acres of trees began to fall. I called the county office immediately, asking about permits and development plans. The clerk seemed uncertain, promising to look into it and call me back. She never did. I took my boat across the lake the following weekend. The destruction was worse than I had imagined. A vast swath of forest had been cleared, and yellow construction vehicles were grading the land. I approached a man who appeared to be supervising the operation. "Excuse me," I said, introducing myself as a resident from across the lake. "I was wondering what is being planned for this area." The man smiled broadly. "Willow Lake Estates, 29 luxury homes with lake access, prime real estate." My stomach tightened. "Are you aware this area floods every summer? The water rises significantly." He dismissed my concern with a wave. "Our engineers have assessed everything. The development has all necessary permits. Maple Ridge Developers has everything under control." I returned home and immediately began making calls to the County Planning Commission, to the Environmental Protection Office, to anyone who might listen. I explained about the lake's natural cycle, the predictable flooding, the potential disaster if homes were built too close to the winter shoreline. At the county offices, I was passed from department to department. Each official listened politely before explaining that all proper procedures had been followed. The permits were in order. There was nothing to be concerned about. It was only when I researched Maple Ridge Developers that I discovered the truth. The company was a subsidiary of a larger corporation owned by the same people who ran Lakeside Community Association, one of the most powerful and notorious homeowners associations in the state. They had political connections throughout the county and a reputation for getting whatever they wanted, regardless of opposition. As I watched the foundation of the first home being poured, I knew this was no longer just about protecting a lake. It was about challenging a system that put profit above nature, power above truth. and I was just one person standing against a very powerful machine. I did not simply sit back and watch the disaster unfold. For the next several months, I mounted what can only be described as a campaign to warn anyone who would listen about the inevitable flooding. My first step was to compile a detailed dossier of evidence about Lake Willow's seasonal patterns. I gathered 30 years of personal photographs showing the lake at various stages throughout the seasons. I found historical records from the County Water Management Office documenting water level variations. I even had topographical surveys showing exactly which areas would be underwater when the lake reached its summer peak. Armed with this information, I requested a meeting with the Lakeside Community Association Board. After several attempts, they finally agreed to a 15-minute slot at the end of their monthly meeting. I arrived early, my presentation organized and my arguments rehearsed. The board members sat behind a long table in matching navy blazers, their expressions a mixture of boredom and impatience. The president, Mark Stevens, checked his watch repeatedly as I set up my materials. "Mr. Thornton, we appreciate your concern for our development," he began before I had even started speaking. "But I can assure you that we have conducted extensive environmental studies before breaking ground." I laid out my photographs on the table. These show the lake at its summer height over the past 3 decades. As you can see, the area where you are building will be underwater in just a few months. A woman with perfectly styled blonde hair picked up one of the photos and examined it with obvious skepticism. "These appear to be amateur photographs. Our engineering team has conducted professional assessments." "With all due respect," I replied, opening my folder of county records, "these are not just my observations. These are official water level measurements taken by the county over 30 years. The board members exchanged glances. A man at the end of the table cleared his throat. "Mr. Thornton, our development plans have been reviewed and approved by county officials. The proper drainage systems are being installed. Your concerns, while appreciated, are simply unfounded." I left that meeting with a growing sense of dread. They had not even looked at most of my evidence. Their minds were made up, their plans already in motion, but I was not ready to give up. The next day, I contacted Professor Elaine Winters, an environmental scientist from the state university who specialized in watershed management. She agreed to review my documentation and visit the lake. After spending a full day examining the area, her conclusion was unequivocal. "This development is situated in a natural floodplain," she stated. "When the lake rises, these homes will absolutely be at risk. Whoever approved these plans either did not understand the seasonal dynamics of this lake or chose to ignore them." With Professor Winter's professional assessment in hand, I tried once more to engage with county officials. I scheduled meetings with the Environmental Protection Office, the Planning Commission, and even the County Commissioner's Office. Each time, I was met with the same response. The development had undergone proper review and met all legal requirements. During one particularly frustrating meeting, a junior staff member pulled me aside as I was leaving. "Look," he whispered, "you should know that 3 members of the county commission are investors in Maple Ridge developers. Your complaints are falling on deaf ears. Or worse, on the ears of people who have financial interests in making sure this development proceeds." As winter turned to spring, construction continued at a feverish pace. The framework for all 29 homes was completed in record time. Landscapers began installing expensive gardens and laying sod. Real estate agents started bringing prospective buyers to view the properties. I encountered some of these buyers while out on my boat one weekend. A couple with two young children was standing on what would become their back lawn, pointing excitedly toward the lake. "We are so excited about our new home," the woman told me when I introduced myself as a neighbor from across the lake. "The kids cannot wait to swim right in our backyard." "Has anyone mentioned that the water level rises significantly in summer?" I asked carefully. Her husband laughed. "The agent mentioned something about seasonal variations but said it was just a few inches, nothing to worry about." I tried to explain further, but they had already moved on, planning where their dock would go, where they would put their boat. They, like the others, were buying into a dream that was about to become a nightmare. By late April, the development was complete. 29 homes stood in perfect rows, their pristine lawns sloping gently toward the water's edge. A grand opening ceremony was held, with the county commissioner cutting a ribbon and declaring Willow Lake Estates the crown jewel of our community's growth. As I watched the celebration from my boat, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. The spring rains were coming early this year, and with them, the inevitable rise of Lake Willow. The first major rainfall came on the second weekend of May. It was not a storm so much as a sustained, heavy downpour that lasted for nearly 3 days. I stood on my covered porch watching the rain dimple the surface of the lake, knowing that this was just the beginning. My rain gauge measured just over 4 inches in those 3 days. The lake responded immediately, rising 6 inches from its winter level. This was precisely what happened every year, the first stage in the lake's natural expansion cycle. I began my documentation process, something I had done casually for years but now approached with scientific precision. I installed measuring stakes at regular intervals along my shoreline, each marked with bright orange tape at 1-inch increments. I set up a camera on a timer to take daily photographs from the same position. I kept detailed notes in a waterproof journal, recording not just water levels, but also rainfall amounts, temperatures, and observations about wildlife behavior. Across the lake, life at Willow Lake Estates continued as normal. Moving trucks came and went as new families settled into their dream homes. On clear days, I could see children playing on the pristine lawns, adults setting up patio furniture, landscapers planting flowers along the newly established shoreline. By the end of May, the lake had risen another 8 inches. My measuring stakes showed the pattern clearly. The water was now 14 inches above its winter level, and the rainy season was just beginning. I took my boat across one evening, cruising slowly past the development. Several homeowners were out enjoying the sunset from their yards. I noticed one man looking with concern at a small puddle that had formed at the bottom of his lawn, some distance from the current shoreline. "Beautiful evening," I called to him. He nodded, distracted. "Have you lived here long?" 27 years, I replied. "Does the lake always do this?" he asked, gesturing toward the puddle. "The water seems to be seeping up through the ground here, not coming from the shore." "That is groundwater," I explained. "The water table rises with the lake. It will continue to happen as the lake level increases." His brow furrowed. "Increases by how much?" "In an average summer, about 20 to 30 feet from the winter shoreline," I said. "More if we get heavy rains." The color drained from his face. 30 feet, that would put the water at my back door. "I tried to warn the developers about this," I said. "This entire area floods every summer." He looked at me with growing alarm. "Nobody told us anything about flooding. The HOA guidelines just mentioned seasonal water variations." Similar conversations began happening all around the lake as May turned to June. The lake rose steadily, gaining an inch or two every few days. The puddles at the bottom of lawns expanded into small ponds. The carefully landscaped gardens nearest the shore became saturated and muddy. The first official acknowledgement from the HOA came in the form of an email to residents, which one concerned homeowner forwarded to me. It described the situation as unexpected moisture issues due to unusually heavy spring rains and assured residents that appropriate measures were being evaluated. I continued my documentation, measuring and photographing as the water crept closer to the homes. By mid-June, the lake had risen 18 inches, and the lowest homes were now just 15 feet from the advancing shoreline. That was when the first emergency meeting was called. I know this because emergency vehicles began arriving at the Willow Lake Estates Community Center one evening, their lights flashing but sirens silent. From my boat, I could see residents hurrying toward the building, many gesturing animatedly toward the lake. The next morning, work crews arrived with sandbags. Dozens of homeowners formed human chains, passing the heavy bags from trucks to the edges of their properties, creating makeshift barriers against the advancing water. It was a futile effort. The water was not just coming from the visible lake, but rising from beneath the ground itself. The entire water table was rising, just as it did every summer. By the third week of June, the lake had claimed the first casualties. The most vulnerable homes now had water lapping at their foundations. Sump pumps ran continuously, their hoses spewing water that simply flowed back toward the structures. The sound of generators became a constant backdrop as homeowners fought to keep the water at bay. I continued my documentation, adding video recordings to show the steady, inexorable rise of the water. On my side of the lake, my home remained safe on its elevated position, just as it had every year since my grandfather built it. A particularly heavy thunderstorm in late June dropped 5 inches of rain in just 24 hours. The lake responded with a surge, rising 4 inches overnight. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of sirens. Emergency vehicles were converging on Willow Lake Estates. The first homes now had water entering their ground floors. I watched through binoculars as families evacuated, carrying possessions above their heads as they waded through knee-deep water. County emergency management officials were directing traffic and helping elderly residents into rescue boats. News vans had arrived, their satellite dishes extending above their roofs as reporters captured footage of the unfolding disaster. That evening, as darkness fell, the pounding on my front door began. When I opened it, Mark Stevens stood there, his composed demeanor completely dissolved. "You have to help us," he said, his voice a mixture of command and plea. "You know this lake, you know what is happening." I looked at him steadily. "I do know what is happening. The same thing that happens every summer, the same thing I tried to warn you about from the beginning." "We need solutions, not reminders," he snapped, although his voice lacked its usual authority. "The solution was not to build there in the first place," I replied. "But since you did, you have only one option now. Evacuate everyone until the water recedes in September." The look on his face told me everything. The man who had dismissed my warnings, who had proceeded with his development despite all evidence, was finally confronting the reality of nature's power, and he was not prepared for what came next. Mark Stevens did not leave immediately after our confrontation. Instead, he followed me into my home, his desperation evident in every movement. His expensive leather shoes squished on my hardwood floor, leaving small puddles with each step. "There must be something we can do," he insisted. "Drainage systems, pumps, anything. You have lived here for decades. You must know some solution." I guided him to my study, where maps of the lake and surrounding area covered one wall. The lake has a natural drainage system, I explained, pointing to the southwestern corner. A small stream that eventually feeds into the county river system, but it can only handle so much water. During the summer months, more water flows in than can flow out. That is the natural cycle. Can we not enlarge the drainage? Dig it deeper, wider, he asked, a hint of his usual authoritative tone returning. That would require county approval, environmental impact studies, and would likely affect downstream ecosystems, I replied. Even if approved, it would take months to implement. Your homes are flooding now. The reality of the situation was finally sinking in. Stevens slumped into a chair, staring at the maps with hollow eyes. 29 families, he murmured. 29 homes, millions of dollars. And all preventable, I added quietly, if someone had listened. The next morning, the full scale of the disaster became apparent. Helicopter footage on the local news showed that 7 homes now had water throughout their ground floors. Emergency management had declared a local state of emergency. Residents were being housed in a nearby high school gymnasium, their faces shell-shocked as they registered for disaster assistance. I continued my documentation, now adding newspaper clippings and recorded news segments to my growing file. The lake continued its inexorable rise, gaining another 2 inches overnight. More homes were affected with each passing day. By the end of the week, the media narrative began to shift. The initial reports had focused on the natural disaster aspect, depicting residents as innocent victims of unusual weather patterns. But as journalists began digging deeper, questions arose about the approval process for the development. A particularly tenacious reporter from the regional newspaper discovered that the environmental impact study required for the development had been remarkably brief and conducted during the winter months when the lake was at its lowest. She also uncovered connections between county officials and Maple Ridge developers that suggested conflicts of interest. When confronted with these findings on camera, Mark Stevens maintained his composure but deflected responsibility. "We followed all regulatory requirements," he stated firmly. "The current situation is the result of unexpected and extreme weather conditions." The Weather Service immediately contradicted this claim, providing data showing that rainfall amounts were actually below average for the season. The lake was rising exactly as it did every year. As public scrutiny intensified, the HOA board began looking for someone to blame. Their first target was the construction company, claiming that drainage systems had been improperly installed. The construction company, in turn, pointed fingers at the engineering firm that had designed the development. The engineers defended their work, stating they had based their designs on the parameters provided by the developers. It was a circular firing squad, with everyone blaming someone else. But then, unexpectedly, I became the target. The first indication came when 2 sheriff's deputies appeared at my door with a search warrant. They were professional but firm as they explained they needed to investigate allegations that I had tampered with natural drainage systems around the lake. "Tampered," I repeated, incredulous. "In what way?" "There have been accusations that you may have blocked or redirected natural water flows to deliberately cause flooding in the new development," one deputy explained, looking uncomfortable with his assignment. I allowed them to search my property, knowing they would find nothing. But the accusation itself was revealing. Someone was desperate enough to cast blame that they were fabricating outlandish theories. The deputies left empty-handed, but the attack had just begun. The next day, a formal letter arrived from the HOA's legal team. It claimed that I had engaged in deliberate actions to create or worsen flooding conditions, and demanded that I cease and desist all such activities immediately. The letter was absurd, containing no specific allegations or evidence, but its purpose was clear. The HOA was establishing a narrative, preparing for what would come next. 3 days later, it arrived. A process server delivered a thick envelope containing a lawsuit filed by the Lakeside Community Association against me personally. The suit alleged that I had maliciously tampered with natural drainage systems, deliberately provided false information to residents, and engaged in a pattern of behavior designed to damage property values in Willow Lake Estates. They were seeking damages of $12 million. I sat at my kitchen table, the legal documents spread before me, and felt a cold anger settling in my chest. The absurdity was breathtaking. After ignoring my warnings, after dismissing scientific evidence, after building in a natural floodplain, they were now trying to blame me for the consequences of their own decisions. As I watched through my window, water continued to rise around the beleaguered homes across the lake. Nature was following its course, just as it had for centuries. And now I would have to defend myself against those who had refused to respect that immutable fact. This was no longer just about high water. This was about truth itself, and I was now fighting for both. The lawsuit against me was both frightening and galvanizing. $12 million was far more money than I would earn in several lifetimes. If the HOA succeeded, I would lose everything. But the sheer audacity of their claims also ignited something within me, a determination to not only defend myself, but to expose the truth about what had really happened at Lake Willow. I began by organizing the evidence I had already collected. My living room became command central, with folding tables set up to hold the growing collection of documents. On one table, I arranged my personal records chronologically. 30 years of photographs showing the lake's seasonal changes, journals documenting water levels, rainfall charts I had maintained since moving to the property. On another table, I placed all the communications related to the development. Copies of the emails and letters I had sent warning about the flooding, notes from my meetings with county officials and the HOA board, the dismissive responses I had received. But I knew this would not be enough. To defeat the lawsuit, I needed to prove not just that the flooding was natural and predictable, but that the developers had known about the risk and proceeded anyway. My first step was to reach out to longtime residents around the lake. Mrs. Alina Winters had lived on the North Shore for 62 years. At 87, her memory was still sharp, and she had photo albums documenting lake life going back to the 1960s. Mr. James Peterson had been the county water management supervisor before retiring 15 years ago. He still had personal copies of reports he had written warning about development in the lake's floodplain. One by one, I visited these old-timers, gathering their stories and borrowing their photographs and documents. Each one expressed outrage at what was happening, both the flooding and the attempt to blame me for it. That western shore has flooded every single summer since I moved here in 1961, Mrs. Winters told me firmly. Anyone who says otherwise is either a fool or a liar. With these testimonials and historical records in hand, I turned my attention to official government documents. I filed public records requests with every relevant county department: planning and zoning, environmental protection, water management, and the county commissioner's office. The law required them to provide these documents, though I knew from experience that bureaucracy could move slowly. To my surprise, responses came quickly. Perhaps someone in county government had a conscience, or perhaps they sensed the growing scandal and wanted to distance themselves from it. Whatever the reason, within weeks I had boxes of official documents to add to my collection. What I found was damning. The original environmental impact study for Willow Lake Estates had indeed been conducted in January, when the lake was at its lowest point. More significantly, an appendix to the report included a warning about seasonal flooding that had somehow been omitted from the final version presented to the county commission. Even more disturbing was what I found in the planning department records. An independent hydrologist had submitted a detailed analysis warning specifically about building on the western shore. His report had been marked, received, but then apparently shelved without action. The development had been approved despite this explicit warning. The most revealing documents came from the county commissioner's office. Meeting minutes showed that the development had been approved during a special session with minimal public notice. The vote had been unanimous, with no discussion of environmental concerns. Most tellingly, financial disclosure forms revealed that 3 of the 5 commissioners had received substantial campaign contributions from companies linked to Maple Ridge developers. As I methodically gathered this evidence, I also sought expert help. Professor Winters, the environmental scientist who had assessed the situation earlier, agreed to serve as an expert witness. She connected me with colleagues who specialized in hydrology, environmental law, and construction standards. Each one reviewed my growing collection of evidence and provided professional opinions that supported my position. Perhaps the most important ally I found was Gerald Hoffman, a retired attorney who had specialized in environmental law. When I explained my situation, he offered to review my case pro bono. "This is exactly the kind of corporate malfeasance I fought against for 40 years, he said after examining my evidence. "They knew the risks, ignored them for profit, and now they are trying to blame an innocent person for the consequences. This is not just wrong, it is potentially criminal." Hoffman helped me understand the legal strategy the HOA was likely pursuing. "They do not expect to win $12 million from you," he explained. "This is about creating a scapegoat, shifting blame away from themselves. If they can point to you as the villain, they might avoid liability for the damage to the homes." With his guidance, I began preparing not just my defense but a countersuit. The evidence was clear. The HOA had deliberately proceeded with a development they knew was at risk of flooding, had ignored expert warnings, and had potentially engaged in corrupt practices to obtain approval. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. A junior engineer who had worked on the Willow Lake Estates project contacted me after seeing news coverage of the lawsuit. He had been troubled by what he had witnessed during the development process and wanted to clear his conscience. I raised concerns about the seasonal flooding, he told me nervously when we met at a coffee shop 20 miles from Lake Willow. I showed them historical water level data. They told me to adjust my models to show minimal risk. When I refused, I was removed from the project. He provided copies of his original engineering assessments and emails documenting how his concerns had been dismissed. It was the smoking gun I needed. By the time my attorney filed our response to the lawsuit, my kitchen table held not just my defense but overwhelming evidence of negligence, misconduct, and potentially criminal behavior by the developers and county officials. The tables had turned. What the HOA had intended as my destruction would become their undoing. The county courthouse was an imposing structure of red brick and white columns, built in the 1930s and designed to inspire both respect and intimidation. On the morning the case was scheduled to begin, news vans lined the street outside. What had started as a local story had gained regional attention, with environmental groups and homeowner advocacy organizations following the proceedings closely. I arrived early with Gerald Hoffman, now officially my attorney of record. Despite his 72 years, he carried himself with the energy and purpose of a man half his age. We navigated through reporters shouting questions, Hoffman deftly deflecting them with a practiced, "No comment at this time." Inside the courtroom, the contrast between the two sides was immediately apparent. The HOA was represented by a team of 4 attorneys from a prestigious law firm, all in expensive suits with leather briefcases. On our side, just Hoffman and myself, with boxes of evidence we had wheeled in on a borrowed handcart. Judge Harold Mayers entered the courtroom, a man known for his no-nonsense approach and intolerance for legal games. After the formalities, the HOA's lead attorney, William Prescott, presented their opening statement. "Your Honor, this case is about one individual's malicious attempts to damage a thriving new community," Prescott began, his voice practiced and smooth. "The evidence will show that Mr. Thornton, motivated by resistance to change and development, took deliberate actions to exacerbate natural conditions and create flooding in Willow Lake Estates." He went on to outline their theory that I had somehow blocked natural drainage channels, manipulated water flow, and engaged in a campaign of misinformation designed to damage property values. The allegations were so specific yet so completely fabricated that I had to resist the urge to interrupt. When it was our turn, Hoffman rose slowly, his demeanor a stark contrast to Prescott's polished performance. "Your Honor, this case is indeed about deliberate actions, but not those of my client," he began. "The evidence will show that Lakeside Community Association and Maple Ridge developers knew about the seasonal flooding of Lake Willow, were warned repeatedly about the risks, and proceeded with their development anyway. When nature followed its inevitable course, they chose to blame the one person who had tried to prevent this disaster." Hoffman laid out our defense methodically, referencing the mountain of evidence we had gathered. He also formally filed our countersuit, alleging negligence, fraud, and reckless endangerment by the HOA and developers. The HOA's case began with testimony from engineering consultants who presented complex models purporting to show that the flooding was unprecedented and could not have been anticipated. Under cross-examination by Hoffman, however, their testimony began to crumble. "Did your models include historical data from the past 30 years?" Hoffman asked one expert. "We use standard meteorological projections," the expert replied evasively. "That is not what I asked," Hoffman pressed. "Did you include historical water level data specific to Lake Willow?" "We did not have access to that data, even though my client provided it to the HOA board before construction began." The expert had no response. The HOA's case further deteriorated when they called Mark Stevens to the stand. Stevens testified that the board had conducted due diligence and had no reason to expect flooding. Hoffman's cross-examination was surgical. "Mr. Stevens, I have here an email dated September 15th of last year. It is from my client to you personally, warning explicitly about seasonal flooding. The email includes historical photographs showing water covering the exact area where you built homes. Did you receive this email?" Stevens hesitated. "I receive many emails." "Your email system shows you opened this one 3 times, Hoffman countered, producing the electronic receipt. "Did you share this information with the HOA board or home buyers?" "We relied on our experts," Stevens replied weakly. The turning point came when we presented our witnesses. Mrs. Winters, despite her age, was clear and compelling as she described 80 years of seasonal flooding. "That shore has been underwater every summer since before most people in this courtroom were born," she stated firmly. Professor Winters presented scientific data showing that the flooding was entirely predictable and followed historical patterns. The whistleblower engineer testified about how his warnings had been suppressed and his models altered. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony from homeowners themselves. Several had agreed to testify for our side, angry at how they had been misled. They described how they had asked specific questions about flooding risks and been assured there were none. Throughout the trial, Judge Mayer's expression grew increasingly troubled. His questions to the HOA's witnesses became more pointed, his skepticism more evident. When the HOA's attorneys tried to introduce a last-minute expert to support their drainage tampering theory, the judge's patience finally broke. "Counselor, are you seriously suggesting that one individual manipulated an entire lake system affecting hundreds of acres?" he asked incredulously. "Without anyone noticing, without heavy equipment, without disturbing protected wetlands, this court will not entertain fantasy narratives." After 4 days of testimony, the evidence was overwhelming. The HOA had known about the flooding risk, had deliberately concealed it, and had then tried to blame an innocent person when the inevitable occurred. Judge Mayers did not even wait for closing arguments. "I have heard enough," he announced on the morning of the 5th day. "This lawsuit against Mr. Thornton is dismissed with prejudice. It is not merely without merit. It is a blatant attempt to shift blame for the plaintiff's own negligence and misconduct." He removed his glasses and looked directly at the HOA's legal team. "Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation of potential fraud and corruption in the approval process for this development. And Mr. Thornton, I strongly recommend you proceed with your countersuit. This court will ensure you have ample opportunity to present your evidence." As the gavel fell, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The truth had prevailed, at least in this courtroom. But for 29 families, justice was just beginning. In the weeks following the dismissal of the lawsuit against me, my focus shifted from defense to justice. With Gerald Hoffman's guidance, we filed a comprehensive countersuit against Lakeside Community Association, Maple Ridge developers, and several county officials who had approved the development despite knowing the risks. More significantly, we expanded the suit into a class action, with 23 of the 29 affected homeowners joining as plaintiffs. These families had suffered the most direct harm from the HOA's negligence, with homes damaged, possessions lost, and lives disrupted. "This is not about revenge," I explained to the homeowners during our first group meeting. "This is about holding accountable those who knew the risks and proceeded anyway, and about securing the resources to rebuild properly." The media coverage shifted dramatically. What had begun as a story about unusual flooding became an investigation into corporate negligence and potential corruption. Newspaper editorials called for a complete review of the county's development approval process. Environmental groups organized protests outside the homes of county commissioners who had approved the project. The district attorney's office launched a formal investigation into the approval process for Willow Lake Estates. Subpoenas were issued for records from both the HOA and county offices. 2 county commissioners resigned abruptly, citing personal reasons. As the legal pressure mounted, the HOA board's unity began to fracture. Several board members, concerned about their personal liability, approached our legal team about settlements. Mark Stevens, however, remained defiant, insisting that the flooding had been an act of God that no one could have predicted. His position became untenable when the district attorney's investigation uncovered direct payments from Maple Ridge developers to a consulting company owned by Stevens' brother-in-law. The payments, totaling over $200,000, had not been disclosed to other board members or homebuyers. Facing criminal charges for fraud and corruption, Stevens finally agreed to a settlement. The terms were comprehensive and designed not just to compensate victims, but to ensure